Hello and welcome, my lovely psychology students. Welcome back to another quick session into attachment. But before we get started, let's just define what attachment is. Just a bit of a recap here. Attachment is a close two-way emotional bond between two individuals. Pause here. It is a close two-way. So it's not one-sided. It's going from the infant to the caregiver to the infant to the caregiver, and the caregiver to the infant. But it's not just about feeding, it's about this emotional engagement. So it's an emotional bond between these two individuals. And each individual, as we carry on, in which each sees the other as essential for their own emotional security. They both need each other. So it's not a one-sided bond, it's a very much a two-sided interaction between the infant and the primary attachment figure. And they're both emotionally engaging with each other. So it's really important that we understand attachment isn't just a bond, right? It is an emotional bond, but it's not a one-sided bond, it's a two-way. So that means they are engaging with each other. There's an emotional reciprocity happening here, right? Because they become reliant on each other. This engagement is happening. So it's really important that we understand this role. But in today's session, we're going to be exploring, first of all, the key question here: who do infants attach to? Who is this primary attachment figure? Well, traditionally, the mother has always been the one to be seen as the key attachment figure. Now, I suppose if we go back in time and we look at the work of things like the stages of attachment developed by Schaeffer and Emerson, their work was carried out in the early 1960s. When we look at theories of attachment, for example, Bowlby's theory of attachment, we're looking around about late 50s, early 60s. And yes, culturally, women were the ones that stayed at home and looked after the children, so therefore we make that assumption. So traditionally, we have always seen the mother being that individual. Even when you looked at the work of Schaeffer and Emerson, they found that infants are usually attaching to their mother within the first few months of their life. So around about 6 months, they're making that specific attachment, and then they're able to then make secondary attachments to, like the father, the grandparents, the aunts, all those familiar individuals, the siblings. So mum's seen as the starting point, and once that primary attachment has been made, then the child's able to go on and make these multiple attachments. So it really does stress traditionally that the mother is this individual. So it does pose the question, are fathers important? In the construct of attachment, what role do they play? Any role? Do we need fathers in this role, or is it solely a mother thing? So it really does pose the question, are fathers important? Now, if you want, take the time, pause here. What do you personally believe? I always like for you to think about what you think of it, because when we're going through the different elements, you'll be able to say, yeah, I can relate to that one. And actually it makes your learning a lot more real. So pause here, have a think. What do you think? Are fathers important? Are they? So let's start looking at the role of the father in attachment. Now, there is a big issue with, from a psychological point of view, to understanding the role of the father, and a bit of AO3, but I will link back to it later on. In psychology, the research into the role of fathers is actually a bit inconsistent, because we have different types of psychologists who are interested in different aspects. So, for example, perhaps culture, biology, and they all pose different questions. And they're all coming up with their answers. So therefore, we're getting these inconsistent findings that make it difficult to actually say, here's the role of the father. So a bit of AO3 to remember there. But let's have a start. We'll start with our first question. It can be argued that fathers play no role in attachment due to traditional cultural roles. So what does this mean? Good question. Now, society is made up of norms and values, it's mores, and we live towards the norms of, for example, our gender, our age. You know, we all conform to those type of things. So perhaps when we look at it according to tradition or culture, it then dictates how fathers and mothers are going to behave and then interact with their children. So in society, there are set social norms, and this applies to the roles of men and women. Men, the father, is usually what we call in brackets the breadwinner, inverted commas, not brackets, inverted commas. And they're the ones that predominantly are the providers. They're the ones that will, throughout the pregnancy, they'll be out working, and when the child's born, they'll be bringing in the income and supporting their family. So very much an instrumental role. You know, they're the providers. Where the mother is seen to be the individual who's a nurturer. She's the one who's going to be caring for the family. You know, she rears the children, she looks after the house, she makes sure everyone's okay. So very much an expressive role. If you do sociology there, you'll see that link in there as well. But you might also say, well, come on, you get house husbands and things like that. Yes, you do. And things are slightly changing, but predominantly, according to the culture, it's going to dictate how fathers are going to interact, and that's going to influence on the role that they play in attachment. Would they become the primary attachment figure or just a secondary attachment figure? So here it does. I mean, look at our society. We've got a woman can take up to a year off just before she gives birth, and then she can have up to a year off of work in order to have that time with her child. So she gets maternity leave. So she can get up to a whole year, where men get 2 weeks. So really that's reinforcing the idea that men can only get 2 weeks off of work. So he needs to get back to work, where a woman can have a whole year so that she can care and bond with the child. So a nice little example there to illustrate that society's social norms are going to influence the roles, so our tradition, our cultural norms. So culture plays a strong role. So fathers are more likely to be secondary attachment figures than primary attachment figures. Looking at our next area of investigation, biology dictates that the father cannot have a role of the attachment figure. Why? Come on, in your minds, think about men and women. Women are biologically designed to fall pregnant, to carry the fetus for the 9 months, give birth. She's designed to feed the child, and even her hormones are designed to make her more caring. So according to a biological, or the biological approach, really, men have no role whatsoever, because men are not biologically designed to give birth, to carry the baby, to feed, have the capacity to feed the infant. And also hormonal. Yes, men do have levels of estrogen, but it's much lower. And women's is much higher, so that actually makes women more tending and befriending. Also, the hormone oxytocin during pregnancy, that increases the amount during pregnancy, and it helps to encourage the mum to be more nurturing and bonding with the infant. So biologically, women are designed, so therefore they should be the primary attachment figure, where men, no role whatsoever, because biologically they're not designed that way. So let's look at another proposed role of the father. And actually it's saying, well, fathers could actually have a completely different role compared to that of the mother. So fathers' roles can be seen as yes, they're not meant to be the primary attachment figure, but they still play a role as a very important secondary attachment figure. And this area is looking at the idea that men play a completely different role. And that could be perhaps more on the rough and tumble, the playing, the interacting for the motor skills, and it's looking at things that taking more risks. You know, come on, jump off of there, dad will catch you. You know, those type of behavior, rough and tumble. Can you remember if you're small, you know, you'll probably jump on your dad's back and off we go horse, or your granddad's back or your uncle's back. It was the male who became the one that did more rough and tumble. Now we've got a nice piece of research here that compared the behaviours of primary caretakers or primary attachment figures of the mothers with primary and secondary caretakers of fathers. And they found that at the age of 4 months old, from analysing the video footage, they were looking at the face-to-face interactions of the mother and infant and the fathers and the infants. And they found that fathers engaged more in game playing, so rough and tumble, and actually held the infant less. So it was the mother who picked up and then had longer face gazes compared to that of the father. The father was the one that would be, if there was a little, a small baby on the floor, they would be rolling them, moving their legs, right? Playing with them, kickaboo and all those type of things, more so than perhaps the mum. So maybe that's telling us fathers are there for a completely different role. And it could be that for that physical interaction. So fathers do play a role, but it's completely different. It is to be a role of a secondary attachment figure, but it's designed for that physical interaction, for increased risk-taking. Now, the final one I'm going to put forward is, can fathers be primary attachment figures? Can they actually become the primary attachment figures? Horrible scenario, baby's born, unfortunately complications, mum dies. Can that father become the primary attachment figure? He can be, yes. The answer is yes. Fathers can become the primary attachment figures. But to enable them to be there, because remember, an attachment is an emotional bond, he needs to be as sensitive as the mother. So that means he needs to have those emotional behaviors and those interactions that a mother would have. So he would have to engage much more in things like smiling, pulling funny faces, vocalization, talking, holding, keeping close and tight. So really, he can become the primary attachment figure as long as he is as sensitive as a mother would be. So fathers can be the primary attachment figure, yes. He just has to take on the behaviors of that of the mother. Now, you can see how we don't really have one specific answer. We can't actually say, well, the father's role is, because we've got all of this saying, well, no, he's there as a secondary attachment figure because he does more of the physical and risk-taking type of interaction. No, biologically, he's not designed. Oh, yes, he can be, as long as he's sensitive. Tradition and society prevents it from happening to be that primary attachment figure. So here we can see we really do have different arguments, and that is a problem because it doesn't allow us to come to the conclusion, what's the role of the father? And are fathers important? So linking just to a couple of AO3s, what has the data shown about the role of the father and attachment? Well, actually, it's very contradictory. We're not getting evidence that's consistently saying the same thing because psychologists are interested in different aspects. They're interested in different aspects, and therefore they will do the research into, for example, the influence of culture, or they'll look at it from a biological perspective. So here we can clearly see, and there's going to be contradictory. Now, another AO3 that I want to bring in is if there is specific roles associated with the father, why aren't the children without fathers any different? And that's a very good question. So if we're saying fathers have a specific role, for example, they play the rough and tumble role, right? They play that more physical interaction with their infants. What about those children who grow up in a lone parent family where there's just a mother? Research has shown that these children do not grow up and become any different compared to that who has a father in the household. So here again, Grossman found that fathers as secondary attachments figures had an important role in their children's development. Yeah, that's what Grossman found, that's what we relied to. Yes, they play a different role. However, they didn't find any difference in children growing up in same sex, so having two mums, right, and perhaps single parent mum, where there was no father to play that role. So really, actually, it would then suggest that father's role as a secondary attachment is not that important because infants don't grow up any differently. So yes, there is a big debate around the idea of the role of the father. But we can say perhaps it could be a combination of all of these. So the role of the father is quite a difficult one to answer. Thank you for spending a little bit of time with me. And remember, it's really important that you are taking the time to recap your notes, construct your revision notes, and even perhaps practice doing an essay plan, for example, discuss the role of the father within attachment for 12 marks. Take care and thank you for spending the time with me.